Hello, and welcome to the Tarvin Family Association YouTube channel. This is the first in a series of recordings about ancestors in the Tarvin family. Today we want to talk about Reverend George Tarvin. I base most of my information on that gathered by my father, Vern Hoffman, who was researching his ancestry and discovered George Tarvin, of English descent, was in the Dunker religion, which is primarily of German ancestry. So Reverend George became very interesting to my father. He put together some information, took it to the Tarvin Family Association, and eventually compiled a booklet that I've used in preparing this presentation. I hope it's interesting to you, and I hope you watch the entire series. Discovering our Tarvin ancestors, Reverend George Tarvin. This is the first in a series of videos we're making about the Tarvin family. I first want to give credit where credit is due. This presentation draws heavily on research by Vern Hoffman, my father, Lillian Williams, Earl Tarvin, Shirley Brown, and many others in preparing this information. And most of the information that you're seeing here is also on the Tarvin family website at www.tarvinfamily.org. And if you have better information and would like to update us, we welcome that. Now, most people know that George Tarvin and Sarah Craycraft, who settled in northern Kentucky, had 13 children. We call them the 13 tribes or lines of the Tarvin family. George Tarvin, who was born in 1744, married Sarah Craycraft 1747. It is very likely that the Craycraft family was in the Dunker religion. They married about 1767 and had these 13 children. So 12 of them were born in the upper Potomac, we call the area of the northern neck of Virginia near the mouth of the Cacapon River. This is in the Virginia-Maryland border area, which is now part of West Virginia. So George Tarvin was born in 1744 in Charles County, Maryland. His parents, George Tarvin and Eleanor Mudd, were second-generation immigrants from England. George's parents died when he was young and was apparently apprenticed in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is just over the Potomac River from Charles County. Later, he shows up in Hampshire County, Virginia, married and owning property and hanging out with Dunkers. Let me show you some of these places. This is an 1823 map of the Virginia-Maryland area, and this is Charles County, where you see Port Tobacco is right in the center, which was a very important shipping port until its creek silted up due to over-agricultural use. Fairfax County is next door, and you see the District of Columbia outlined there, which was not present when George was a boy. And then later, we go up the Potomac River to the Hampshire County area of Virginia. This area has now become part of West Virginia since the U.S. Civil War. Well, who were these Dunkers he was hanging out with? The more formal title of the religion is German Baptist Brethren. They grew out of the Pietist movement of the late 1600s, which included the Mennonite and the Amish and others. They were organized in Schwarzenau, Germany in 1708 by Alexander Mack, and the 8 original members were baptized by triple immersion, that is, one each for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, in the Elbe River. The Brethren have no official creed, taking the entire Bible as their creed, and their goal as Pietists was to live as close to Bible teachings as possible. As I mentioned, they practiced the triune baptism, and therefore they got the nickname of Tunker in German, or Dunker. They also practice a full communion service, a love feast, including a meal and washing of feet. In the fellowship of believers, they believed that they should marry in the faith, and therefore they have very close family connections. And in appearance, they practice simplicity, very much like you see today among certain religions. They were persecuted and sometimes prosecuted in Europe, and beginning in 1719, the Brethren sought refuge in America, mostly migrating into Pennsylvania, where other German-speaking people were migrating. They formed tight-knit communities, intermarrying among a few well-known family names, and along with other plain people, the Dunkers and others came under the whole notion of the Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, the Dunkers are peaceful people. They were one of the historic peace religions among the Quaker and the Amish, and they were often conscientious objectors to military service. On the frontier, this went as far as not carrying arms and making friends with the Indians. Some Dunkers were imprisoned, actually, for not helping the revolutionary cause. Other religious practices included they met in homes rather than in buildings or special churches, or outdoor in groves of trees when the weather permitted. The early members kept no records, and their leadership developed slowly, and only in the late 1700s did they actually designate and ordain leaders. That's when the church buildings and record keeping began. Now, the Dunkers were first established near Philadelphia in Pennsylvania and in parts of Maryland, and they generally moved away from the population centers into sparsely populated frontier areas of western Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. These areas included the valleys of what I call the Upper Potomac, the Shenandoah, the Cacapon, and others in the northern neck of Virginia. This is called the western extension of the northern neck. So what did a Dunker look like? If you think Quaker or Amish, you probably wouldn't be far wrong. Here's a picture of some modern Amish men and women on their way to services. A couple of others from the internet. The Tarvins farmed in the Upper Potomac, northern neck region. George Tarvin had acreage along the Little Cacapon Creek, about a mile from the Potomac River in the northern neck. This valley land is very fertile, and the terrain between the ridges is very flat, which captures the rain, which is slow to run off. And between 1769 and 1794, 12 children were born to George and Sarah in this area. Here's a map from about 1736 that shows the lands that are part of the northern neck of Virginia that belong to Lord Fairfax, which is an interesting story in itself. But as you see, as we zoom in to the area that we're interested in, the Little Cacapon River flows into the Potomac up here. In a modern topographic map, you'll see that same location in the middle of this map. I'm going to give you a higher resolution, and you will see how the river flows very gradually into the Potomac and the various creeks that flow into it. Interesting thing about this map is that very few names used at the time of Reverend George's sojourn here are still on the map, and yet Cowgill Lane or Coggle Lane is a name of an area that is very important to the Tarvin family. It's still there in the northern neck region. So why did the Tarvins move on from this fertile land? Well, actually, I think they probably played out the land. After about 10 or 15 years of planting the same crops every year, without fertilizing the way we understand today, the land is no longer fertile. Another reason is that they needed additional land as their sons grew up and wanted to start families for them to farm. Still another reason was that attitude of needing some freedom in the area. For example, if you remember in the story of Little House on the Prairie, when Pa saw 3 people riding by, he thought that the area was getting too populated. So too many neighbors would cause somebody to feel, let's go find someplace more remote. I think also that there were too many floods in the area to be comfortable. I mean, a flood every 20 years might be tolerable, but I think if it occurred every 2 or 3 years, they would get very tired of it. In the interior area, the Indian danger to white settlers had been suppressed by about 1790, and so people were starting to move on. As a matter of fact, it was a general trend that people would head west after the Revolutionary War over the Appalachian Mountains and into the fertile Ohio and Kentucky areas. And how did they go? Well, it looked like they probably floated down the Ohio on a flatboat, similar to this one depicted here. They probably made their way overland to Pittsburgh and then purchased flatboats or built them in the area from the trees around Pittsburgh and floated down the Ohio River to a haul out called Limestone, which is now called Maysville, Kentucky today. The George Tarvin family with the 12 children, and the oldest son had several children of his own, and quite a few of their neighbors and friends, apparently migrated down the Ohio River to Kentucky in late 1794. They landed at Limestone, which is now called Maysville, and proceeded to Shannon Church, which was then a Dunker church. George Tarvin settled his family in Mason County, Kentucky, and then his 13th child was born in Mason County, which means that either Sarah was pregnant on the trip or that she was tending the youngest siblings, which were very small children at the time, during this arduous journey. In Maysville, Kentucky today, there's a mural on the flood wall labeled Limestone Landing, and you can see depicted here in the painter's view of several families pulling in their flatboats to the landing, and you see in the background some log cabins that were built from the logs and planks that made up the flatboats. In the Maysville, Kentucky Gateway Museum, there is this diorama showing the same scene of people pulling up and landing and adding to the population, and you see in the background the village of Maysville and what's now called historic Washington, Kentucky is being built. So this is a modern depiction of how it might have looked at the time. Now, Mason County was a concept that included, from the period of 1789 to 1795, this entire area of northern Kentucky. The northern border, of course, was the Ohio River, and over the course of 1795 to about 1808, all the rest of these counties were created out of at least part of old Mason County, and Mason County itself was left in the middle there. And this is the area where Reverend George and his family settled. Even though they might have settled in Mason County, other counties might have been formed around them. And the original landing, I said, was at Maysville, and then the original stopping place was Shannon Church. Shannon Church still exists. Of course, it's a new building, and here's the new building. But you see many of the old gravestones there, and a big burial mound, which might have been an Indian burial mound. So Shannon Church is now a United Methodist church, but at the time, the area was a Dunker building. In August of 1796, a Dunker minister named George Tarvin presented credentials of ordination to the Mason County Court with the request to perform marriages in the state of Kentucky. He had already married his son Richard to Sarah Armstrong. Now, we call him Reverend George because he performed over 40 marriages in the next 4 years, and we need to think of him not so much as a preacher man, but rather as a marrying Sam. So rather than having a congregation, he probably had a following or a reputation that he would be the one to go to if you wanted to get married out on the frontier. And he was probably not called Reverend in his lifetime, but probably brother because he was in the Brethren Church, or might even been called deacon because of his ordained position. But we refer to him as Reverend George because it helps us differentiate between him, his father George, and his son whom he named George. And so Reverend George becomes a flagpole in our pedigree that we can move from. He moved, or possibly Fleming County moved to him. In 1801, he purchased 100 acres on the waters of Fleming Creek. And then while in Fleming County, Reverend George performed 35 more marriages. About this time, 1806, his wife Sarah Tarvin dies. And then in 1807, he married Mary Wood, who might have been Mary Gardner. There's another evidence of him being in Fleming County because there was a Dunker church there at a place called Log Union until the 1840s. And many of the grave markers in that adjacent cemetery contain the names of couples married by Reverend George in Fleming County. Here's a picture of the site of the church today with the cemetery in the background. And here's a picture inside the cemetery where you see it's very overgrown and the stones are hard to find and many of them are broken down. But it was surveyed at one time, and we know the names of people buried there, and they may have been the same people who he had married. So it's logical to assume that he was part of this congregation. In addition, he was a witness in a court case, and he gave his signature to a court document in 1804, which is reproduced here with his name and then the word seal in curlicues at the end. In 1809, when he was 65 years old, George Tarvin moved to Bracken County, Kentucky, possibly to live at or near the property of his wife, Mary Wood. While he was in Bracken County, he performed 23 more marriages. Well, Reverend George apparently received some injuries when he was working in a grist mill and died in January of 1813 at Augusta, Bracken County, Kentucky. The probate record shows that he was a man of very small worldly means, and after his estate was sold and the claims were paid, his widow's portion was only $12.29. So his life record, although sketchy, shows a man of integrity and great commitment not only to his family but also to his religion. So where is he buried? We haven't yet found a gravestone. The possibilities are he's buried in Bracken County, where he died, or in Fleming County, where many of his friends are buried. But we've also found no grave for Sarah, who died in Fleming County, and it's possible that he might have been buried near where she was. That's hard to say. Our research continues, and we will update you at our website. So the heritage of the Dunkers in the Tarvin family is that very few of Reverend George's children carried on the Dunker religion beyond 1 or 2 generations. However, Several of his children were ministers of the gospel or wives of ministers, mostly Methodists and other religions. Shannon Church, of course, became Methodist like many Tarvins. It's fair to say that the influence of Reverend George is felt yet today in his progeny throughout the country. Now, as the Tarvins settled in Kentucky, they proliferated. And I'm showing you here a list of the children, the date they married their wives, the number of children they had, and the date of the last child that were born. And of the 13 children, we now can see there are a total of 104 grandchildren of Reverend George Tarvin. So his family connections have been vast. His progeny has been vast. So the Tarvins have spread from these counties near the northern edge of Kentucky into all of the states and even overseas. And that story will be continued in another video of this series. I thank you for watching, and I hope that you appreciate our ancestor a little better and are interested in finding out how you connect to Reverend George and other Tarvins that you might know. Thank you.